Watch this over again. I'm going to do some finish grinding on these wasps. This will be a pretty short live stream. As soon as these wasps are done, I will be moving on, doing some handles with them. So I might go live twice today. But I've got 7 wasps here, 5 in ADCRV2, 5 in Nitro V that I just got roughed in. Now I'm going to do a 60 grit, and then we'll go to the surface grinder and finish the sides out. What's up, Waleska knife? Good to see you, Chuck. Jump over to the surface grinder. I shortened the tripod all the way up and put it on the bench behind the grinder. So let's do that again. So I've got to surface grind all these knives. A couple more times. Just a second, I'll show you what all we got going on. There we go. All right, so I've got a bunch of wasps that I'm trying to get finished up for the drop this Friday. These are in ADCRV2, and then I've got 2 of them in Nitro V. Now, they've been surface ground already to a 120, and now the bevels are at a 60 grit. The bevels are at 60, the sides are at 120. So now we're going to take the size of cheeks down to 400. We're going to start with 220 and then go 400. And then after that, I'll be ready to finish the bevels out to 400 as well. Step it up 120, 220, and then 400. Now that the blades are all caught up to the same stage, that's what we're going to do. So I've got you sitting up behind the grinder. This process is kind of back and forth between that table and the surface grinder. I'm going to swap out this 120 belt for a 220. We'll go ahead and get at it. See that? So there's the before, there's the after. 120, 220. What's up, Ben Harrison? Enough precision knife work. Alright, now we'll switch to a 400 grit. Thanks, KRC. Who else did I miss? George. What's up, George? What's up, Fed Harrison? Good to see you. Alright. That's all for the 220. Now we'll do the 400. Make them shiny. About the same amount of time that took. Do it all over again. So there's the 400. There's the 220. It's close, but this right here is definitely way more shiny. 220, 400. See the difference? What's up, Deb? I'm using 220. I use a 120 ceramic, same that I use for all my finish grinding. And then I use a aluminum oxide X-weight 220 and 400. No, they're not VSM. They're from Maverick. They're from Maverick Combat. Same company. These belts are pretty dang good for $275, $250, something like that a piece. Get my tripod open back up here, and then we'll go at it with the grinder once more. What's up, everybody? Give me just a second. Stop shaking around. All right, there we go. So here I'll show you what I'm using. Precision Knife Works. That's what I use on the surface grinder there. And I use them for, let's just leave one right here. I use them for finish grinding as well. In ceramic, I use 36, 60, and 120. And then in aluminum oxide, and I only use X-weight. I don't use any J-Flex belts because I don't do a lot of contouring. I do have a couple J-Flex belts, but mostly just X-weight. Same for the 400. I like this sticker belt. For the surface grinder, so the bump lines were tough for me to figure out, and I ended up buying. So this is a Beaumont surface grinder, KMG surface grinder, and it's for their KMG grinders. But I learned with the surface grinder, because this attachment's like $2,000, and it comes with a small wheel, like a 3-inch wheel. And I learned that the smaller the wheel, put this down over here, carrying around the belt like a dumbass. Put this down. I'll show you the wheel that I started with. The wheel that I started with, surface grinder, looked like this one. And it hasn't been used a whole bunch. But it's too small. And it's really hard. It's a hard durometer wheel. In fact, it has been used so little that now I'm getting some dry rot on the inside. It's just kind of been sitting. But this is what I started with. And I could not get rid of the bump lines, the belt seam. And so I talked to Beaumont about it. And Andrew sent me another wheel. This one's 3.5 inch, and this one is a 60 durometer. So it's a lot softer than this one. This one's like a 120 on the durometer. Super stiff. Be good for hollow grinding. But this one's close to a 4-inch wheel. But this right here works okay. Problem is, it's still too small. So the smaller the wheel, the more defined that that belt seam is going to be, the harder you're going to be pushing into what you're grinding. So I ended up just buying the 8-inch wheel, and this was the ticket. So this on the durometer is pretty soft. I want to say it's like 80. So it's a little bit harder than that little 3.5, 4-inch wheel. But the key here is that the size of the wheel really spreads out the belt a lot. Now, I do still have problems with a little bit of belt bump, but I kind of figured, honestly, if it's not that noticeable, then it's not too big of a deal. And sometimes the belt bump will show, but for the most part, it just won't. And the biggest key for that was not the belts, but the size of the wheel. So if you're on a small wheel, you try and get to a bigger wheel, and you'll be able to alleviate a lot of those belt bumps, and it won't be such a problem. But as far as belts, I use the Maverick, and their backers are not amazing, but they're workable. All right, so I got us a 120 rigged up here. Now I'm gonna do the bevels to 120. And then 220, and then 400. Now on this stage, I really just don't want to get them wet because the sides are finished. ADCRV2, if it gets warm while I'm grinding, it'll start discoloring. So I don't want to get them wet. I'm just going to do one side at a time, then we'll come back through and sweep the other side. Like that. Gotta do my little shoulder chamfers and sledges. Go. Now, go to 220. Gonna relax the speed of the grinder. Slow it down just a little. Yeah, there. Do the same thing, one side at a time, so as not to get them too hot, and I don't want to get them wet either. So there's 120. You can still see that it's kind of rough, but on 220 we're starting to get that rainbow look. Pretty nice. the other side now. All right, do 400 now, and that'll be the end of those. Last step. Now they'll get shiny. You guys are probably wondering why I keep touching the edges like that, because as they get thinner, they get harder to see. So if I keep hitting them with the next grit up, they keep getting shinier and easier to see. There's that 400 grit that we're looking at. That's what we want. Same thing. Now to the other side. That's all the bevels. Now we got to get all the swedges and the chamfers. Finished blade. Ready for handles. Thanks, man. One more. Stubborn one. Always one. have it. What's the deal? Thanks, mainly off-grid. I'm using 2 different kinds of steel here. 5 of these blades that I've got are these 5 right here are in ADCR V2, and then these 2 on the end are in Nitro V stainless. The only way that I can tell them apart right now is the stainless is nice and shiny on the inside of the holes, and all the ADCR V2 is black. Got some oil crusties in there. I will not remove all that. I'll leave it because as long as it's got that burned on oil from the quench, then it won't rust inside of those little holes. Now, I'll seal these handles up when I do the handles, make sure and do my best part that I can to try and keep them from rusting. But, get out of my way. That is wrap on those Wasps. Now all I've got to do is demagnetize them right quick. And I'm not even going to discuss the differences. So at this point, from that surface grinder, they are magnetized because I had to use that magnetic chuck. I don't want them magnetized because they're just going to pick up and hold all this little tiny microfine dust. Might be able to hear it buzzing. That's what happens when you drop one onto it. I have to keep them off of the plate because if you touch it to the demagnetizer, it'll remagnetize it. Those Nitro V blades are pretty quiet. You can hear it buzzing a little more. That's because I just started doing a carbon steel blade. Carbon steel has more iron content, therefore it is more magnetic than stainless steel. Stainless steel is composed of more things that are non-magnetic. Guys, if you like this kind of content, knife making, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up if you have not done so already. And if you really enjoy this stuff and you want to see it again, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell on the channel. I'll let you know when I'm going live again, which is as often as I can possibly do it. But I do show pretty much every process of knife making live here on this channel. And the best part is, a lot of these knives you can go pick up on the drop on Friday on our website, verygoodknifeco.com. I'll be dropping these Wasps and some Hornets, which is just a bigger version of this Wasp. The device that I'm using is called a demagnetizer or a degausser. That's all it is. It's just demagnetizing them. So over here on the surface grinder, it has a magnetic chuck. This right here is full of magnets. In between each one of these little slots is a magnet. When I surface grind them, they turn magnetic. So now these blades are ready for handles here. Let's see what kind of thicknesses we got. So for the Wasp, I really like about 15 thousandths starting thickness at the edge, which will leave us about 16 to 17, maybe 18 behind the edge This one is sitting right dead on. I'll try and get it to where you can see. Sitting right dead on 15 thousandths. That's where I like them. This one, about 14 and a half. Close enough. It's pretty thin, but it's meaty and plenty beefy enough to handle daily use. This one is sitting just the tiniest little hair. It's not even a whole half a thousandths. Not even a whole half a thou off of 15 thousandths is sitting right dead on 15 thousandths. That's pretty consistent for not measuring them whilst I'm grinding. This one's sitting about 14 thousandths. That one is a thousandth shy. I'll have a little thinner edge. Same for this one, 14 thousandths. That doesn't bother me. I don't want to see tolerances over about 3 thousandths between them all. This one same, 14 thousandths. So the noteworthy difference right there, those first two blades were 15 thousandths, both of them at the edge. The rest of them were slightly thinner at 14 and a half, 14 thousandths. The difference there is that those first two blades were Nitro V. Nitro V is about 2 points harder on the Rockwell scale than ADCR-V2, therefore making it slightly more difficult to get thinner than the ADCR-V2. What I mean by that is, naturally with a softer steel, you will inadvertently take off just slightly more with the same pressure. So if I applied the same pressure to all of them over the span of the run, we ended up with half a thousandths to a thousandths difference. It's pretty interesting, right? Now, these guys are ready for handles, but until I am ready to get handles put on them, I'll just leave them soaked in oil. There you have it. All right, let's run in here, and my oven's beeping. I'll show you what I got in the oven. Cooking up some blades. All right, so let me go grab my screwdriver, because I've got one in the counter bend. All right, we've got some ADCR-V2 blades, and I had one that had the tiniest little warp to it after the quench. Now, 90% of the time, I'm able to get that little micro warp out. If you counterbend them while they're still hot after the quench, now it is perfectly straight. If they get cooled too much, which you only have about 30 seconds, 25 seconds to do it after they're quenched, but if you get them fast enough, you can straighten them out. And sometimes they just cool down and your eyes deceive you. You pick one back up after you thought it was straight, and it wasn't quite straight. Anyway, here's 3 counter strikes. All 3 of these are drilled for the removable screws, the Gulco bolts, and all 3 of those will be Gen 3s. And then I got a couple more Mustangs because I had the steel. And I wanted to fill out a heat treat, or fill out the kiln. Anyway, there's some blades. They just got done with round 1 of temper. They go in twice for 2 hours and 10 minutes at a time. And that was the first cycle. So I will let them cool all the way down to room temperature again, and then they'll run again. They'll be done, and then we'll be ready to turn them into this. So again, we've got some Wasps. This one is an 80 CRV2. You can see that black oil junk crusty inside of the, I do, Seth. Welcome in. VeryGoodKnifeCo.com. VeryGoodKnifeCo.com. Let's see if you can see that up here on the sign. There you go. Check it out. Thanks, bud. What's up, Zachary Hess? Yes, sir. It was National Knife Day weekend. I didn't expect many people to jump in on that one, but they did. Anyhow, guys, I'm starving. I'm absolutely starving. I'm gonna go find myself something to eat, and then I'll come back and get started on all these handles. Now, all these Wasps are gonna get Grip Tech handles, and I think I'm gonna use Viridian black and some OD green. Anyway, I'm gonna have me something to eat and then get some handles started. Then maybe I'll go live again later today. Thanks for watching, guys. What's up, John? Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the